Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Hello, welcome to our panel discussion on refugees and the war in Ukraine. My name is David FitzGerald. I co-direct the Center for Comparative Immigration Studies at UC San Diego, and we're co-hosting today's event together with our colleagues at the UCLA Center for the Study of International Migration, the UCLA Center for European and Russian Studies, and the International Institute at UC San Diego. Following the February 24th Russian invasion of Ukraine, around 12% of the population has fled the country. The UN Refugee Agency, the UNHCR, reports that as of yesterday, more than 5.4 million refugees have left, including 3 million who are in Poland alone. 6 countries have received 350,000 or more, including Romania, Russia, Hungary, Moldova, and Slovakia. The Biden administration has recently announced that it will accept 100,000 Ukrainian refugees and has opened a new private sponsorship channel to do so. There's an even larger number of people, an estimated 7.7 million, who have been internally displaced within Ukraine. The UNHCR estimates that even more, 13 million people, are stranded in affected areas or unable to leave because of the conflict. These dynamics come on top of other displacements caused by the war in Donbas since 2014, and the movements of asylum seekers and other migrants from Asia and Africa who intended to transit Ukraine, many of whom stayed long-term as Ukraine itself became a host country. Our panelists who are here to help us understand these dynamics are Professor Marta Pachoka, head of the Migration Policies Research Unit at the Center of Migration Research of the University of Warsaw, Professor Marta Bivand Erdal, co-director of the Peace Research Institute in Oslo, Marta Rozumek, executive director of the Organization for Aid to Refugees in Prague, Professor Raphi Rechitsky from National University and an expert on experiences and policies of forced migration within, to, and through Ukraine, and Professor Rana Khoury, currently at Princeton and soon taking a faculty position in political science at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. A special thanks to our colleagues in Europe who have given up their Friday night to join us live. The order of activities today is that each panelist will take 5 minutes to make an opening remark about a particular aspect of the situation. I'll then pose a set of questions to the whole panel. And then for most of the event, that'll be devoted to a Q&A with everyone on the call, including the panelists and the audience. During that open discussion period, please electronically raise your hand and you'll be unmuted to ask a question, or you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and I'll pose that question to a panelist. So let me start by inviting Marta Pachoka to make her opening remark, please.
Thank you very much for this invitation. Hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to join for the very first time one of your webinars. So very briefly, what is the current state of play in Poland regarding the crisis we are going on in Ukraine? So the first point is that I would say that we have 2 different crises going on. One is the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine, and another one is the refugee crisis going on in Poland. So as we know from the data provided by the UNHCR on a daily basis, so far, Poland received almost 3 million people fleeing Ukraine. Intentionally, I say people or forced migrants from Ukraine because these are not only Ukrainian citizens. Still, we assume that 95% of those that are coming to Poland are Ukrainian nationals. So Poland is considered by the UNHCR as the primary country in terms of receiving forced migrants from Ukraine. What is interesting, and if we compare it to the developments in Europe in 2015, the issue is about the very large scale of forced migrants that came to Poland within 2-3 first weeks. So this was almost 2 million people. If we look at the developments and numbers from 2015 in Europe during the so-called migration and refugee crisis connected to the Mediterranean region, that time it was 1 million, but within 1 year, and not only to one country. These were mostly Italy and Greece, as you remember. So very large scale influx of the people, and then Poland, that is not typical destination country for forced migrants. So the question was, how our country, how Poland can address this challenge. And the reaction was very positive. I would say that we are, as researchers, but also as post, surprised how positively, how openly the society reacted, and to what extent it provided the support. So maybe going directly to the actors that played a key role in receiving forced migrants during the first 2 months as of now, I have to stress that the key role was played by our non-governmental organizations and by civil society. Also, they were supported by local governments from border towns, so the towns that are close to the Polish-Ukrainian border, including Przemyśl and Lublin, but also big cities, including our capital city, Warsaw. Then also we should mention, and it was stressed very often by media and also by our politicians, are volunteers. So simply every Polish citizens, but also the Ukrainian diaspora, because we have to remember that Ukrainian migration is not a new phenomenon in Poland. Before the crisis of February 2022, we've received many, let's say, economic migrants, voluntary migrants from Ukraine. So the number of these Ukrainians from pre-2022 period is estimated at 1.35 million people. Even some researchers stress that this phenomenon of high inflow of economic Ukrainian migrants to Poland before 2022 is a kind of Ukrainization of labor migration to Poland. So I've just said about NGOs, local governments, volunteers, and then the government. So the government played a crucial role 2 weeks later, because they provided, the politicians, they provided a new legal framework to receive migrants. So simply the new law was announced on the 12th of March, the law providing support to Ukrainian migrants, but the point is that this law is very selective. So it addresses the needs and access to public services only of Ukrainian citizens and their families. So it might be an interesting issue for you to discuss later. And finally, we should remember about a huge support provided by the international organizations. So we have the UNHCR office in Poland very active. The so-called regional refugee response plan was launched. At the beginning, the assumption was that it will be implemented by August. As of now, we know that it will be implemented at least by the end of December 2022. Another important actor, obviously, is the European Union, because Poland, we are one of the 27 EU member states. So we are also covered by the EU asylum policy and EU legal framework regarding international protection. What is the state of play as of today? We have moved from this short-time emergency humanitarian period, and we are in fact now in the reception phase that may take up to 1.5 years, because this is the time that our government provides a legal status, legal stay for Ukrainian refugees according to this new law I've just mentioned. And finally, we should take into account another international actor as IOM, but IOM is mostly involved in the support to third country nationals other than Ukrainians. So the first 2 weeks were important in these terms because there were also, for example, non-Ukrainian students living eastern part of Ukraine. They moved to Poland and then they were supposed to return to their countries of origin, many of them from Africa. I think that I will stop here and I will give the floor to my colleagues. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Marta, Bivand, Erdal.
Thanks very much, and thanks for having me. So I'll also keep this quite brief. So David asked me to speak a bit about sort of the response in European countries beyond those that are neighboring to Ukraine. I think I'll tag nicely onto what Marta already said in a sense. So I thought I should just start with some of the context. So I'm sure most of you know that the EU has decided to have this temporary protection scheme, which they actually regulated for already in 2001, but they never used it. So on 4th of March, there was this unprecedented move to actually use this protection system. And I'm sure we can discuss later, you know, why now, why not before, and these kinds of questions. And it was sort of unprecedented the way it went about on a systemic level, because of course, migration and asylum are extremely contested within the EU as a political issue. And the specific political context here of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and its proximity to EU countries is sort of, it's everywhere. I think I want to stress that also in this context, because I'm sure you all know this, but the proximity of these things within Europe are something which I think just can't be stressed enough, especially if you're looking at this maybe from a North American or an Asian context, where it's just much further away. So that's at the systemic level. Now, that's all interesting and good, and in principle, that's great. Ukrainians who were already in EU countries or who arrived after the 24th of February, and indeed also residents of Ukraine who exited Ukraine and entered into EU countries after that point in time, were then supposed to have a fast speed track to protection, similar to asylum, but not through the regular asylum route. Now, the reason why not is mixed. One reason is, of course, the sort of proximity to the war and the political backdrop of that, as Marta already underscored, just this unprecedented scale. And again, I think this is important to stress, although I know we know this, all of us that are on this call, but if you look at the numbers of arrivals, not just in 2015 or 16 within Europe, but across the 10 last years in terms of asylum seekers, what has happened within the last 2 months are just much, much higher numbers. So I think this sort of scale and proximity just cannot be stressed enough in this context. Now, the EU regulations, I think one of the interesting things about this protection mechanism is that I think many people working in this field agree that this actually would be a good idea overall in terms of how we relate to people seeking asylum. Because what the system means is that you have a fast track where you don't put people in basically in waiting centers where they have to wait for months, years sometimes, and basically become completely passive. But instead you allow people to have residence permits and to work. And it's a temporary protection. And in European context, we've had this before in relation to the wars in the Balkans. And sometimes that protection becomes permanent, sometimes it doesn't. And I think that's also important to stress in this context, that it is a temporary protection mechanism, and what will happen down the line, none of us know. But that's also the context of it, which is the reason why it can be fast-tracked in a way. If it was permanent, politically, that wouldn't be possible. So I think it's an interesting question how this will affect the way we deal with these issues in Europe later, because this approach solves many of the huge problems we've had with the current asylum system in Europe, which is, I think, as most of us know, incredibly flawed on very many levels. I'm not going to go into numbers deliberately, and I think some of our colleagues later on will come into numbers a little bit more as well, but I'll say a couple of things in relation to why I'm not really wanting to say anything about numbers. And that is that the numbers are incredibly uncertain. So Marta already mentioned some numbers in terms of border crossings into Poland and also into, we could mention Romania or Hungary or the other countries neighboring Ukraine. We don't know how many people are going back. We don't know how many of these crossings are multiple border crossings. Because Ukrainians who initially had biometric passports and later on anyone could move freely between EU countries and also into the EEA area, we don't actually quite know who's where. And we do know that there are a lot of people in Germany. Germany is also close to Poland. There were also many Ukrainians there from before. We know there are quite a few also in Italy. Again, there was a diaspora there before. We know there are quite a few in Spain. We know Turkey has many as well. Interestingly, Norway has been preparing for a lot of refugees to arrive. They don't seem to be arriving. So there's kind of a capacity to receive people, but there seems to be perhaps a desire to remain rather closer to Ukraine because there is this hope of peace. And I'll actually end on this sort of more broader comment that we might want to come back to in the discussion later on. I think what is interesting from a sort of not neighboring country perspective is that what is happening with the mobilities out of the war in Ukraine is in fact, I think, very similar to what we see in many other conflict contexts around the world. But just this is now in Europe, and we're not used to that in Europe. So the EU and the European states and also populations to an extent are behaving as if this was kind of something we know and we don't. This is like being Lebanon, or like being Jordan, or like being Turkey in relation to Syria, or like being Afghanistan. Afghanistan's neighbors, Pakistan or Iran, for many, many years, and hopefully this situation will be resolved much faster than that. But I think that's just sort of flips completely how we relate to the issue. And I think it does something to how we can try and understand it as well. So I think I'll end there, and hopefully we can come back to some of these issues in the discussion. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Martin.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me to this event. I represent Organization for Aid to Refugees, shortly OPU, and we celebrated 30th anniversary of our work last year. Basically, we started with the war in Bosnia, when the Czech Republic received 5,500 Bosnian refugees, and 1/3 of them returned, 1/3 of them integrated in the Czech Republic, 1/3 was reunited with family members in other EU member states. Since that time, we never had large numbers of refugees. After we entered the European Union, we never had more than 2,000 asylum seekers coming to the Czech Republic annually. So for us, the arrival of 300,000 Ukrainian refugees in less than 2 months is something very extraordinary, and it requires a lot of new recipes and policies to be established, because we are rather small country. 10 million is the overall population number. Out of it, 700,000 are foreigners or immigrants in the Czech Republic, and less than 2,000 annually asylum seekers. On the other hand, Ukrainians belong to the largest national group in the Czech Republic. So before the war, there was a minority of 200,000 Ukrainians in the Czech Republic, mainly labor migrants. So I was pretty sure that the Czech Republic would become one of the final destination countries. It is not the Syria scenario, because the Syrian community is almost zero in the Czech Republic. So it was pretty sure that they would not come and stay for a long time. With Ukrainians, it's a different story. We expect that out of these 300,000, probably 200,000 could stay in the country forever, and it would be our task to help them integrate quickly. Our organization immediately on 27th of February, we opened a hotel for Ukrainian refugees of 250 beds. It was full in 2 days. Then we started an operation in cooperation with the city of Prague in the main train station and main bus station. So we received on average 6,000 refugees daily on the Prague train station, which is incredible for us, because usually we know every single asylum seeker personally. With this 2,000, we are present in all refugee camps and 5 cities. So this is something very, very demanding for us. The temporary protection, I think it's a good tool. It was activated for the first time in Europe's history. And what worries me is the uncertainty what will come after the temporary protection scheme is over, because the Czech authorities are not willing or able to say whether the Ukrainians would be able to stay or not after the temporary protection scheme is over. In fact, it would be a huge opportunity for the Czech Republic, because we have had the lowest unemployment in the EU for last 5 years. So basically there is zero unemployment in Prague. Everyone who wants to work finds a job easily. And the salaries, of course, are not high, but basically we need everybody. So I think we could be grateful that 300 mainly young persons, because we are talking about from 80% about mothers with smaller children. So I think it's also an opportunity for the Czech society and for the Czech government. The temporary protection scheme allows immediate access to the labor market, immediate access to the full-scale health insurance. So we see people coming in with very, very difficult diagnosis. And I must say that the people coming now are in worse shape than the people coming at the beginning. So we see a big demand for psychological help, because the people fleeing the war need this care very urgently, and we always lack the capacity in this specialized care. So I think that will be the main challenge: where to find enough doctors, where to find pediatrists, where to find teachers, Czech language teachers. It will be a big challenge for the whole society, but I think we will manage. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Raphi, Rechitsky.
Hello. Thank you again for having me. This is a wonderful event, and for David and CCIS organizing it. It's great to be here. And so I wanted to begin by acknowledging not just the, as has already been said, really not just the scale and proximity of this crisis to Europe, and but also the speed. We're witnessing, a very fast growing refugee crisis, possibly the fastest one since World War II. I think be difficult to rely on many of the data that are coming out on flows, as has already been said, actually, by some of my colleagues within the EU. But besides the very understudied, David mentioned 13 million who are immobilized and mobilized within Ukraine. But if we were to think about just those who are internally displaced and are able to move, there, in addition to the 7.5 million as of last week, and I'm happy to talk about this later, there are also 4 million people who have departed Ukraine. I think 4.5 million if we consider, 4.5 million rather, if we consider the about 600,000 that have supposedly been returned according to Ukrainian government data. Regardless, the scale of the crisis and its speed is fundamental to understanding before we engage in any discussions and some of the current hot button questions about the legal, social, political complexities that could explain why refugees from Ukraine versus refugees from other countries to Europe have been perhaps or perhaps not treated differently. So we can look at current debates about Danish refugee admissions in, or the U.S. Title 42 at the U.S.-Mexico border and its soon possible demise. But my goal is not to kind of entertain some of these debates themselves, but rather I want to begin by observing that the concern for justifying or problematizing kind of the equity between Ukrainian refugees and other refugees, both from the left and the right, from rights groups and politicians in Europe, assumes that there's a supposed division between refugees from Ukraine and refugees from other countries. But this assumption, even though it is very true, as my colleague who spoke first mentioned, right, that 95% of those fleeing Ukraine are Ukrainian nationals. It's still important to understand this because the assumption takes for granted that in a world fraught with many conflicts and a withering refugee regime, that people move around, forced migrants move around and settle many times in different countries. Also, for a second reason, I think refugees, non-Ukrainian refugees, are important to understand those who flee Ukraine. Also because we assume that refugees can be divided into kind of primordial ethnic categories or primordial national categories. Those from Ukraine or those from outside Ukraine, those are ethnically Ukrainian even or not, without observing or understanding the kind of the multicultural legacies and even current realities of Ukrainian society. So first of all, as kind of a disclaimer, we should still mention that many Ukrainian refugees speak Russian, even though they speak Ukrainian. And if we were to take seriously this idea that Ukraine is a Ukraine from a post-colonial lens with respect to Russia, we should not justify Ukrainians from various Ukrainians being excluded from various social informal benefits, as I've heard reported from the ground from different NGOs. For instance, translators being hired by German welfare agency that discriminate against Ukrainians who can't speak perfect Ukrainian. So excluding Russian dominant Ukrainians only plays into Putin's kind of ethnic imperialism that's used to legitimate this war. But outside of that important issue, what I really want to bring to light is a further broader issue of that 5% that Marta mentioned, right, of refugees, and why that's important to consider, because they really are the most vulnerable. From most of them are excluded from temporary protection status. I want to turn our attention to their reception and really begin to think about it in light of kind of the history of the reception of refugees in Ukraine. These are people perhaps least likely not just to be displaced just internally within Ukraine, but also least likely to return to Ukraine, perhaps from abroad. We're talking about, in terms of numbers, there's only 2,200 recognized refugees in Ukraine from 63 countries, but there are also many tens of thousands of asylum seekers. There's between 1,100 and 2,300 or so asylum seekers in Ukraine every single year between 1996 and 2020. And this also includes about at least 30,000 stateless people as of the outbreak of the war, as estimated by UNHCR partner in Ukraine. This is all on top of, we can take educate, I guess, of much larger populations of international students that, grew on top of, and then after independence over, 2 decades of Soviet exchange, worker and student exchange programs. And there's many private universities and public universities in Ukraine that attract tens of thousands of engineering, medical, and other students from Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, as well as Southeast Asia. In Ukraine, so when we're talking about these various figures of, on one hand, international students, labor migrants, we should also not forget refugees are also part of those flows, and asylum seekers are a part of those flows. And it's important to think about this. Also, if you recall, there's these, you might have seen images of a young boy who was in the early days of the war. He was highly circulated in the press. He's walking to the Polish border alone. He's crying. He has a backpack on. He's a small backpack on, and there's, you can see other press taking pictures of him. And he was touted in the press as a Ukrainian boy, but he was a Syrian boy. He was a Syrian boy he was a Syrian boy. He's been who grew up in Ukraine and whose parents had, supposedly perished in Syria, and who had spent as an orphan in Ukraine with perhaps some distant relatives. So this image, right, that we think we underappreciate just how significant some of these early flows are for these for kind of non-Ukrainian refugees. And I can later tell you a little bit more about where these refugees are in discussion that I've tried to keep in touch with on a daily and weekly basis. But I want to go back for a minute to 2012 and 2015, when I spent 15 months in Ukraine studying refugee reception, interviewing refugees, international and state and civil society groups. And so there's an importance to telling you a little bit more about how some refugees who had intended to stay in Europe, right, often arrive in Ukraine, and they often end up settling in Ukraine, even though their intention is to go to the EU. About more than half of the refugees I spoke with end up settling in Ukraine and making lives there, even though their intention had been to go on to the EU. But refugees themselves don't have a say in their own fate. and at least not in the constraints of the international refugee regime, right? They're part of the local integration program. There was a lot of international funding that was supported in EU by the EU for a UN program in Ukraine for the local integration of refugees that I've argued in some of my work kind of pertains to a kind of a soft remote control, as David refers to remote control in his work. I kind of talk about this as a soft remote control as humanitarian kind of incentives, as we've seen in Turkey on a much smaller scale in Ukraine. But I think this is also relevant for what we end up seeing in Ukraine down the road with internal displacement, actually. And I can talk about that a little bit more. I wanted to end with the introduction by saying that the crisis with Ukrainian refugees presents an opportunity. Many of whom are stuck in for reception countries like Poland, like Moldova especially as well, present an opportunity to support and rethink the international refugee regime, and also both support and rethink, right, and how we treat receive and on to secondary destinations in Europe today, as well as how the international refugee regime shares responsibility across Europe and the world, both for Ukrainian refugees and how they are seen, because many of these many of the most vulnerable refugees who are in Europe right now, who came from Ukraine, don't have access to temporary protection, and so we need to make sure they are also, if not centered, but a part of the conversation.
Thank you for that set of issues, Raphi. Rana, Khoury.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the organizers for putting together this impressive panel. And I should say, when David first reached out and invited me, besides my initial sort of pleasant surprise of him being in my inbox, I said, but are you sure this is intended for me? Because this is a panel about Ukraine. But so I'm here to give some sort of perspective in comparison with my sort of more area of expertise on the Syrian refugee crisis, and 2015, what's called the European refugee crisis. And so please feel free in the discussion to tell me where I've gotten some of these similarities and differences that I'm going to try to point out wrong. So as soon as the Ukrainian conflict began and refugees began fleeing, many people in the media were crying out, or on Twitter, about this sort of selective empathy and the double standards at this site of Europeans being just so very receptive to people fleeing conflict. And this apparent difference was not just a difference from 2015, but a difference from, a month earlier, when Denmark was pushing Syrians to return, when Poland and Bulgaria were jockeying over people in their borderlands who were freezing in the forest. And people, in calling this out, were pointing to the role of race in producing such different receptions, also religion. And of course, in addition, or, we can argue about how much these different factors are shaping reception, but of course, there's also politics, there's geographic proximity. These same dynamics matter in the global south, where countries that host most of the world's refugees, geopolitics and proximity also play significant roles in shaping refugee reception in the global south. And those similarities are notable, given that those countries in the global south enjoy far less capacity to host large numbers of people. So I want to talk briefly about some of what I see as some of the similarities in the Syrian refugee crisis and the Ukrainian crisis. Because, maybe just through the passage of time, some of us can forget some of these dynamics. So first, with Syria and the conflict in that country, nobody expected it. Syria was a refugee host state. So despite that some ideas that conflict is endemic to the Middle East and North Africa, or MENA, Syria was considered a very stable country. As well, people didn't think it would last long. When I first went to the field to do my research in Jordan, the Syrians I encountered told me again and again, we thought we would be coming for a few weeks, a few months at most. Syrian refugees, there are 5.7 million of them in neighboring countries and 6.5 million internally displaced, constituting about half of the country's pre-war population. These numbers are really quite similar to the 5.4 million Ukrainian refugees and the 7.5 million internally displaced in Ukraine. There's nearly 3 million Ukrainians in Poland, as we've heard, which is quite similar to Turkey, where there's 3.7 million. So we see how, one or two neighboring countries can come out as really hosting a very large number of people who have fled, although, of course, the Polish population is smaller in size than the Turkish population. But here especially, we see the role of empathy, of the geopolitical variety. There's rivalries with the state responsible for causing the displacement in both the Turkish and Polish cases. There were also periods of sympathy for Syrians in Europe. In September 2015, the tragedy of Aylan Kurdi, whose body washed ashore, Austria and Germany were prompted to open their borders. We remember images of Justin Trudeau in Canada meeting Syrians at the airport. So there was some sympathy for some times. And I am wary of sort of putting all of Europe together as being sort of blocking so much migration. Germany suspended the Dublin procedure for Syrians. By the end of 2018, there were 1.8 million people with a refugee background in Turkey, the majority of whom were Syrians. As well, from Syrians' perspective, Syrians are voicing far more empathy with Ukrainians than they are resentment at the double standards, not just for shared experiences with displacement, but also in their views, the cause of that displacement, as they see Russia as an aggressor in the Syrian conflict as well. Now I want to turn to some of the differences. As has already been pointed out by the presenters, is the pace. Syrians were relatively slower to displace. Their displacement only began in significant numbers in 2013, which was nearly a year and a half into the violence. And it took them about 3 years to reach the similar numbers as Ukrainians that I pointed to at the start. While Syrians were slower to displace, Europeans were slow to act despite that ample lead-up time to respond to the emerging crisis. Ukrainians, as we've heard, were quick to displace, and Europeans have been quick to act. They've been acting collectively, giving Ukrainians the temporary protective status that we've heard about. They've been cooperating as the European Union, and their cooperation is producing different outcomes. In the Syrian case, that cooperation within the EU was in striking deals, for instance, with Turkey to keep Syrians from crossing. Another difference is the danger. In 2015, more than 3,500 lives were lost in a journey to Europe. The routes got more dangerous as more obstacles were erected. In March 2016, Slovenia, Croatia, Serbia, Macedonia closed their borders within even the EU. The Balkan route to Germany became tighter. I think it's an open question as to whether the mixed migration is different. Often in 2015 in the European crisis, we hear that it was a mixed migration, that there were people who were coming for all sorts of reasons and not just as refugees. But 75% of those arriving in Europe, in fact, were from Syria, Afghanistan, and Iraq. These were conflict-wrecked countries. I think the politics, whether it's different, is to be determined insofar as the rise of the right wing in Europe that has followed the migration crisis. I think we don't know the answer to that because that took time. We don't know what European reception for Ukrainian refugees will look like in 1 year, in 2 years, in 3 years, and 4. So the big takeaways for me are, while we do see this greater sympathy of European reception for Ukrainians, we also see quite a different sympathy with regards to the war itself. There's an investment in the war in Ukraine in a way that there was not an investment in the conflicts in these other countries, rather than just sympathy for the externalities of those wars. And of course, the pace, which is strikingly different. We see here clearly that displacement is endogenous to borders. It is endogenous to reception. The drivers of displacement are not just in the conflict country, but in the options for people to flee it. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rana. So let me start by posing a couple of questions about reception and taking up Rana's issue that she raised about the future of reception to our colleagues on the call who are based in Europe. As of last month, again, just according to the UNHCR, 90% of Ukrainian refugees were women and children. And how is that low percentage of men shaping refugee experiences, public perceptions, as well as policy responses? And then relatedly, are there any signs suggesting whether this initial welcome will be sustained?
Should you indicate who is going to answer, or can we just like
go ahead and jump in? Go ahead and jump in.
Okay, perfect. So thank you very much. I also took notes when my colleagues were discussing their points of view. So in fact, my feedback is directly to your questions, but also I would like to refer to some points that were raised by other speakers. So in terms of the structure of the population, refugee population that is coming to Poland, that's true that women in productive age prevail, and kids. So most of them are really kids, not even teenagers. So the question is if it helps to receive them in Poland, for sure, because this is natural. That when we have this picture of family, lonely women, kids, we have this feeling that we should support them. But it's not the only point. As I've mentioned before, Ukrainian migrants, both males and females, are not a new group of foreigners for Polish people, because we know we have many Ukrainian colleagues in our work. We have many Ukrainian students at the public and private universities, and we are familiar with Ukrainians simply. So for us, I say here on behalf of the society, it's much easier to accept them. The question is, and we already see it, how even if they have the full access to all the public services, they can be matched, for example, with the labor market. Because as in the case of the Czech Republic, and Martin mentioned it, also in case of Poland, the unemployment rates for the national economy, but also for local labor markets, are very low. And for us, it is rather very easy to absorb a huge number of newcomers to the labor market, but there is the issue of structural gap. So we are in need rather of male workers, not of female workers. So far we see this discrepancy. Another issue is that there are linguistic skills that are very often necessary to work in Poland. So here comes the question of the language training, language courses, I mean Polish here, for newcomers. And there is a lot done in this domain by non-governmental organizations, and also by, for example, some universities offering free of charge Polish courses. Then obviously the issue of taking care of kids. So according to the Polish law, and this is something positive, any child between aged from 6 to 18 has to join a public education system. So it covers primary and secondary education. Higher education is excluded. So even within EU temporary protection or our specific Polish temporary protection for Ukrainians, any kid is allowed, even should be enrolled to schools. But it does not concern all of them, because once again comes the issue of the language. So many mothers are supposed to stay at home with their kids to take care of them. So this is the issue of labor market. This is the issue of kids, of language. Then when we are discussing the issue of perception, what really matters is also the narrative or discourse that is launched by the government. So this case, this time, in comparison to 2015, there is no negative, hostile discourse launched by the government. And as we know, since 2015, this is the Law and Justice Party that has the power. And in 2015, 2016, even 2017, the political and public media discourses regarding migration were very hostile. It was also reflected, for example, in our unwillingness to implement the 2-year temporary relocation scheme for asylum seekers from Greece and Italy, even if we were forced to do this because it was strongly rooted in the EU primary law and then followed by 2 council decisions. So we see this difference in the narratives. The narrative is not even neutral, it's rather positive. So even today, I've just found the new stance by the President Volodymyr Zelensky saying how Andrzej Duda, our president, is a great friend of him because he, the Polish president, provides great support to the Ukrainian society and to the Ukrainian politicians. So we see this big shift. It might be explained by different reasons, maybe because if this is about the elections that will come in the following months, so maybe it's about the political capital, but maybe it's also about the geopolitical context and our own interests, so security and safety of Poland. It was also mentioned by, I think, by Raphi. So the issue where we are located and the fact with whom we have borders. So just maybe to draw a short picture of the geographical context of Poland on the map of Europe, in the east, we have only one short part of eastern EU border with another EU country. So simply there is Schengen zone with Lithuania, but then we have a long border with 3 non-EU member states, so third countries. This is Russia, Oblast Kaliningrad. Then this is the border with Belarus. And we know that Belarus is strongly influenced in political and socio-economic terms from Russia. And then comes the Ukrainian border. So simply it's in our vital interests not to have such a long border, being at the same time Eastern EU border with the country as Russia, that should be considered as a country that is very unstable these days and very unpredictable. So I think that this political and safety related issues also matter a lot to the narrative that is launched by our government. Also, you mentioned, Rana, the issue of these double standards and selective empathy. I have to say that we have this in Poland nowadays. So I assume that you've heard what is going on or what has been going on since September 2021 on another part of Polish border with Belarus. So we have like double standards. We are open and friendly and very supportive to Ukrainian refugees, but at the same time, we are still rather hostile to those that are trying to cross, even if illegally, our border with Belarus. And obviously the migrants coming from this direction are mostly from Middle East. And even they are not allowed to submit that asylum claim for a regular proceedings for a refugee status. So this is also about this double standard and selective empathy. I think I will stop here.
Thank you. Anyone else? Yes, Martin.
Yep. Thank you for the question, and I would like to react on David's remark and Rana's words. It certainly plays a role that in vast majority women with small children came to the Czech Republic. The level of solidarity is incredible. I would never expect that from the Czech society. The positive role of politicians is very important. And as with Syrians, all the politicians were very much against. Now there are no politicians who would question this level of solidarity and who would play against Ukrainian refugees now, which is very, very important thing. And then I see, to react on Rana's words, three big differences if we compare the Syrian situation and the Ukrainian situation. First of all, with Ukrainians, it's much easier because we all know them. We live with Ukrainian for 20 years. My children, they are at schools with Ukrainian classmates. We have friends, Ukrainians, so there is no fear of unknown as it was with Syrians. And this is a big advantage for Ukrainians. Then another important thing is that they are not coming illegally as Syrians. I think the international refugee law is constructed in a way that you have a right to refugee status, but you don't have a right to arrive, to select a country where you would like to go. So basically, you should stay in the neighboring country, and that country should accept you and give you the rights according to the 1951 Geneva Convention. So there was this discourse that Syrian refugees are illegal migrants because they did not have this legal way to come. And this is very different with Ukrainians because they have the visa-free regime, and basically they can choose any EU country they want to come and stay, which is much easier for them and also much easier for the society to accept that they are not illegal migrants as the Syrians was labeled, which I didn't like at all, but that was the case in the Czech media and in the Czech political life. And then I would also say that there is a difference in a sense that unfortunately Syrians came during the time that there was this wave of terrorist attacks in Europe committed by Muslims, and Syrians were considered as dangerous group that could pose a risk to the Czech society or to the societies in Europe, which was totally unjust. I didn't like it at all, but that was the discourse, that basically terrorists are coming with the group of illegal migrants from Syria to Europe. And as Rana, I see a lot of similarities, and I think the crises are very similar. But I think these three differences make a big difference in the reception of Syrians and in the reception of Ukrainians. Thank you.
David, can I just jump in briefly? Thanks. So I'll also try and respond to your question, but I also wanted to respond to a couple of things that my colleagues on the panel mentioned. So especially maybe the issue that Raphi was mentioning is with refugees displaced again and again and again. And especially we know that there were Afghans who were quite well integrated in Ukraine before, which doesn't mean there was no racism in Ukraine. There happens to be racism in pretty much every society around the world, including in Ukraine, but still that was their home, and many of them had been there for a long time. And so it really is a question of global protection issues. And I think that's important also because of what Rana was mentioning in terms of the similarities and differences. And I've also been trying to sort of grapple with, so what is it that is similar and different? And I would say I agree with everything you said pretty much. And I think one of the things that I find is really constitutes a key difference is that the crisis in 2015-16 was a border crisis, a border management crisis, and there was a humanitarian crisis at the border to the EU. And as Marta was also mentioning, that border crisis is still there. And we have deaths in the Mediterranean ongoing pretty much on a daily basis. And we have this situation on the Poland-Belarus border. So the EU borders are deadly. And that's kind of the crisis there. Whereas the crisis with refugees from Ukraine is the war and the brutal invasion of Ukraine. And so that doesn't justify any racism, obviously, and it doesn't justify the incredible inequalities and mobility rights people around the world have. which directly affect which opportunities for protection they have. But it does sort of shed a light on the difference in what is going on and how and why European states therefore also are responding differently to it, because one situation is within EU borders de facto, because the neighboring countries, except for Moldova, are EU members, and the rest is outside of EU borders, which means it's third countries, and they're beyond these deadly borders. And I think it's a very sort of banal point, but I think it's also really important to understand, because it really explains some of these crucial differences in treatment, which is just incredibly unfair. And then just briefly on the population composition, I think it's the same in pretty much all of the countries, because these are the people that are leaving Ukraine, so women and children. And I think sort of two reflections. One from the Norwegian context, where as I mentioned, there's very few that actually have arrived, and among those that have arrived, relatively few have, more or less half have registered so far, and they're being asked to register in order to get the rights that they have through these protection mechanisms that are there. But the reception system isn't geared up to receive them, even though there's so few that come to a country like Norway, and this is the case for other countries as well that are further afield from the neighboring countries. So there seems to be a sort of crisis of reception, even though compared to not Poland, but compared to the Czech Republic as well, there's just so few, a fraction that is arriving. And there is this sort of sense of not knowing quite how to deal with it in terms of schools and kindergartens and these kinds of things as well, which compared to what is going on in Poland or the Czech Republic or other countries that are receiving many more people, seems quite absurd. So I'm mentioning this because maybe it's hard to spot that looking at this from the US, but there are huge differences within Europe, and how Europe is sort of collaborating on this. I think the jury's still out. I'm really curious what will happen if the war is not resolved and people can't return. How will actually the other European countries be supporting Poland, especially, but also the other neighboring countries, and also the Czech Republic and Germany, who may be other countries who have the most refugees. So there's money involved. There's talk of all kinds of compensations and things, but how actually that European solidarity will work, I think we still are yet in unknown territory. And it is this huge question of uncertainty in terms of time frame that I think is sort of omnipresent when we're discussing these things.
Thank you. I'd like to pick up on what you said about return and invite anyone on the panel to weigh in on what do we know about how people who have left Ukraine are thinking about whether or not to return. How are they making those difficult decisions? Obviously, the nature of the battlefield and the war is also highly dynamic. What can you tell us about that? Anyone?
So if I may jump in very quickly with some numbers, because just a few days ago, we were discussing it with directors of the Warsaw higher education institutions. So we are, as we know, we are still missing the good, reliable, and comprehensive data on any aspect of the crisis. But obviously, very often we rely on the data that are provided by UNHCR in this case, or by the EU. So I have just in my hands, I think that the most recent still results from the 19th of April by the UNHCR. So the research was on movement of Ukrainians back into Ukraine from Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Moldova. So we see that in recent weeks, so let's say that from early April, the rate of or the absolute numbers of Ukrainians coming back to Ukraine is slowly increasing, especially in case of Poland. But does it mean that this is long-term return, or rather this is what is typical for Ukrainian migrants in Poland, at least, circular migration? Another explanation might be the fact that last week, I think, this was the week of Easter, of Orthodox Easter. So many people wanted just to reunite with their family members, with their husbands, with their brothers that have to stay in Ukraine because of the mobilization. So simply males aged 18-60 are not allowed to leave the country. But the respondents were asked why, what are the reasons for their return. So 32% stated that perception, that it's about how they perceive the safety in area of return. So simply we know that Russian soldiers are moved closer to eastern part of Ukraine, so Donetsk and Lugansk. So it might be the reason, but it does not mean that there are no aggressions going on still, for example, in central part of Ukraine on western one. 31% stated reunite with family, as I said, and 20% that this is about something temporary to be fixed, like shopping, bringing family, or just visit the family members. So even my students, because at Warsaw School of Economics, my first university, we have many Ukrainian students and female students mostly. Now they decided to get back to the country just for 2-3 weeks because of the Orthodox Eastern, but also to try to convince, for example, their mothers and grandparents to join them in Poland, because we see that there are many people that do not want to leave their country. So my feeling is that this war just enforce or make the Ukrainian identity stronger. So even now we assume that from the Ukrainian false migrants we host as of now in Poland, so more or less 1.5 million, these are our estimations out of these 3 million that cross the border. So still we think that many of them, if the war is fixed, they will return because they want, because this is something to prove this Ukrainian statehood and Ukrainian identity as the nation. So this in terms of return. So we see them rather temporary, rather circular mobility, and we do not know what the future will bring, because it will really depend on the developments in terms of war.
Yeah, Marta, that is all very helpful on the survey. I'd love to see what the results were. I was going to add that I think we can learn a lot from the war before the war, from the Ukrainian displacement from Luhansk and Donetsk occupied by Russian separatists in the last 8 years, and the patterns of those displacements, both within and without Ukraine. If we just look just internally within Ukraine, and you think about some of the motivation, in light of some of the motivations why Ukrainians today might take a trip back or come back and to return, we can look back at the situation during the war. And if you can look at even UNHCR, there's great UNHCR data there about where and who moved within Ukraine. Out of 2.2 million people displaced from that war, there's 1.5 million who were more than 1.5 million that were within Ukraine, who are 99% of them are from Luhansk and Donetsk Oblast, not from Crimea, and they're fleeing the fighting. And a lot of them, if you can look at where the women and children are and where people with disabilities are, they're always closer to. They're usually within Luhansk, Ukrainian-controlled Luhansk and Donetsk Oblast, so they don't even go very far to Ukraine. And this can be explained by several factors. So when I spoke to people on the ground, and it was clear that unlike today, where there is cash assistance, even internally within Ukraine, then social benefits, even the meager social benefits that people with disabilities and some families rely on, were tied on based on where you live. So people would stand in 3-5 hour long lines to go through Ukrainian checkpoints just to go back and receive their benefits, their social benefits in Ukraine. And many of the we think that people move as they're able to, based on their resources, based on their abilities. We should also consider some of the constraints to to their mobility based on kind of social policy. But with regard to, but I also want to echo Marta's point about the importance of, the gendered dimension of the migration, that women and children are visiting their families. There's multiple reasons for that, such as men who've stayed back. Many men cannot leave, unlike the war before the war, where a lot of Ukrainian men would often try to sometimes ditch the draft and try to emigrate. Today, that is strictly enforced, and men stay. Unless you have a disability, granted disability by the Ukrainian state, you cannot leave. And this is a coveted document that sometimes, wars often don't resolve corruption issues that unfortunately remain. These are documents that are often only accessible to those who have resources, and the vast majority of men cannot leave at all. So it makes perfect sense to me, Marta, what you've heard back on your survey, that women and families are coming to visit, perhaps, and also get convinced their elderly parents to leave as well. And so, yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Raphi. So, toward the end of the event, I'll give everyone on the panel maybe 3 minutes to wrap up with whatever comments they would like to make as reaction. But now let's open everything up to everyone else on the call. If you have a question that you would like to pose directly, that would be the most efficient way forward. Just raise your hand, please, and we'll unmute you, or you're welcome to use the Q&A function as well. So questions from the other participants. Yes, go ahead, Irina.
Thank you so much for this really insightful discussion and amazing panel. My question is about public institutions. I'm curious if there is any information about the ongoing activity, if there is any ongoing activity in public institutions such as education, maybe health as well, and how we've been talking about comparisons between Ukraine and Syria. Can anyone speak to comparison of public institutions operating or being limited in their operation? Thank you.
Should I jump in or leave the space to my colleagues?
No, go ahead.
Okay, so yeah, so the issue of different stakeholders involved in this, let's say, Poland's response to the crisis. Obviously, the public sector is a key stakeholder in terms of the infrastructural and financial capacities. So I would say that from the point of view of the implementation of real actions, these are local governments, in case of Poland, that are really crucial. So let me give you the numbers that we have from and for public institutions and their services from Warsaw. And these are the very recent data I got from my colleagues from the City Hall, just for Tuesday's evening presentation I've mentioned I had. So the situation is, we have to say, pretty good in terms of big cities, because simply big cities have the capacities to receive foreigners in general. So, for example, in big cities like Warsaw, Krakow, Wrocław, or Gdańsk, or Lublin, we have language schools. We have also NGOs very often cooperating with local government, and these NGOs being the main provider of very fieldwork support, like language, like care, like labor market, and so on. So the numbers for Warsaw from the 26th of April, as an overview, what was the state of play? So the number of people that, let's say, went through or passed through Warsaw from the end of February is estimated by the City Hall as 700,000, but only 300,000 are considered as those that decided to stay in Warsaw so far and benefit from this Polish version of temporary protection. Also, the new act for Ukrainian refugees allows them to register with the municipality of any city or town to receive a very specific ID. So in Poland, each of us has its own number. It's not precisely ID number or passport number. By the number that, let me give you the full name in English to be very precise. So we have something that we call PESEL, so Universal Electronic System for Registration of the Population. So 11-digit number that allows for an identification of a specific person. So Ukrainian refugees that came to Poland after 24th are allowed to apply for this PESEL, and it makes possible for them to access any services also with online access. So these numbers are also important for us and public authorities to estimate how many of these people are really staying in the country. So the numbers from April, from late April, in terms of these PESEL applications are for the whole Poland almost 1 million. For the Mazowiecki voivodeship, so the region where Warsaw, the capital city, is located, is more than 190,000, and from Warsaw itself 90,000. Then the numbers of children and teenagers that are covered by primary and secondary education, so it's 16,000 for Warsaw. Then the number of people that are registered as unemployed, so simply those that declare they will to search for a job, is up to 2,000. And then the places, let's say the places of the city's accommodation, so where the people can stay for short time, so let's say the short time accommodation, is as of now 86,000. So we see that the local government and local level institutions provide rather a good support. The problem is with the support provided from the central level, especially with the money. So this is now our main issue when we are discussing this with the colleagues from municipalities. Even this afternoon we had this meeting, an open seminar about the capacities, relocation, and housing. So housing is accommodation, at least midterm accommodation is necessary. And simply cities do not have enough place to offer these people the proper housing and living conditions. I think that maybe that's for this moment, not to monopolize the discussion.
Laurie Hart.
Hi, thank you so much for this extremely informative panel. It's wonderful to hear your thoughts. I had a question about European solidarity. I found those comments really interesting, particularly with reference to the relative absence of solidarity for reception previously during the Syrian crisis in 2015 and afterwards. There were, of course, individual countries who made generous gestures at various moments. But with reference, for example, to Greece, a lot of concern about being left to handle the migration crisis by themselves. Obviously, there was support, but very kind of erratic. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts might be on a change. There was, of course, solidarity against the reception of migrants. And I wonder if this shift in relationship to Ukraine, what are your thoughts on the promise of more solidarity around reception, a more coordinated and future-oriented policy in the EU itself, or with reference to EU solidarity and migrants? Thank you.
I can maybe start, and then others can chip in. I obviously don't have an answer, but I can try and comment and offer some reflections on it. So I'm relatively pessimistic, I think, for a couple of reasons. So I think, between 2015 and 16, there was quite a lot of movement of migrants across Europe. And so while Poland and Hungary did not accept many, and there was a kind of sway towards the northwest of Europe, of course, Germany received many, Sweden proportionately even more, and countries like Norway and Sweden and Finland and basically all the other members of the EU, especially and the EEA area, especially in the northwest, but also along the southern part of the EU, not only sort of to the southeast, did receive and did give asylum in the end to quite a few of those people who arrived. And because there are so many countries, even though the numbers weren't that high in each one of them, apart from Germany and Sweden, there were quite a few that actually went on. So I think that picture is also a little bit mixed. And then since then, the numbers of asylum seekers have fallen, and that's not random. That is exactly because of the EU-Turkey deal. Now, Poland is a member of the EU, so they're not going to make a Poland-EU deal because it doesn't work like that. But still, I think that's an interesting reference point to think through, because it is about who's going to actually be doing the work of assisting people, providing these places in schools, in hospitals, making sure that all these social benefit systems work, etc. And of course, within that context, also there is a question of what do people themselves think? In this case, people who have moved out of Ukraine. And I think there's an important question there as well. And I think there's a couple of reasons why there hasn't been a more organized approach to relocation. That there are political reasons within Poland on that, which I'm sure Marta could say more intelligent stuff about than I can. But there hasn't been a political pressure from the Polish government at all to do this. Quite to the contrary, weirdly enough. And one of the reasons that is maybe more sort of easy to be sympathetic to is that many Ukrainians have also not wanted to move further afield, and those that have wanted to move where they have relatives, which makes sense, and they've done so, and they haven't had to have help or papers to do so. So it's kind of a bit of a chaotic situation. And I think one of the reasons why it's also been so chaotic is that it was this unprecedented scale and speed, and the war that is actually happening in Europe. And so it's not mainly in Europe on our news. It's not mainly about migration, refugees, displacement. It's not, sadly, mainly about the humanitarian crisis and the suffering of civilians in Ukraine even. There's a lot of that on the news as well. But it's mainly about the war and the military questions around the war. And so I think that sort of contextualizes in Europe what is going on. Hopefully after there is a peace and we can take a step back and actually try and learn something from this, there will be lessons learned. And I hope that will also involve solidarity within Europe. But far more than that, I sincerely hope it will involve solidarity with people displaced around the world, because I think that's the real problem. Within the EU, they'll figure stuff out, I think. I think Poland and the other neighboring countries may have reason to complain. Well, let's see. But I think the real issue is the one which happens beyond the EU borders. And I'm not so hopeful, but I do hope that there will be lessons learned about solidarity beyond the European borders as well.
I can chime in here, because we can think about European solidarity or support as a matter of being receivers and receptors of refugees, but we can also think of the money that they can provide to refugee host states elsewhere in the world. And traditionally, this has been the sort of grand bargain that global North states provide the funding to international organizations to support refugee host states in places like the Middle East. However, on the one hand, you could be optimistic and say that, maybe Europeans have gained solidarity for people fleeing conflict situations. But you can also see how it can very easily go and already has gone in the other direction, where in fact, humanitarian aid funding has already been redirected from other crises around the world to respond to the Ukrainian crisis. So you can also even see the money itself flowing in these ways that are unlikely to sort of revert back to those other places anytime soon.
Yeah, and if to kind of continue that line of reasoning that Rana has proposed, if we look at refugee policy in Ukraine and how the EU has approached that part of the world, but long before the war and before even the war in Donbas, You know, after the accession of Poland and Slovakia and Hungary and Romania, you know, there is a growing there's growing mobilization of resources towards building up Ukrainian migration control, capacity building, with the border guards working with trainings from EU agencies. And eventually, after some criticism on you know, human rights issues and immigrant detention, eventually more money for refugee affairs. But even I've written about this a little bit. Even some of the support for refugee programs has been aiming to you know, root refugees in Ukraine and prevent them, incentivize, right, programs that root people in place, right, programs for local integration, while we've seen you know, slashing of resettlement programs, not just in Ukraine, but all over the world. So we see even the ways in which, you know, humanitarian is, you know, we see this regime shifting, as Alexander Betts calls it. He has a kind of a rosy picture of how this, how these resources start moving towards humanitarian affairs. But I think even if they stay even within the refugee system, you know, we see kind of hollowing out, right, of that international structure, and instead we see European solidarity based on some kind of what's not a primordial, then kind of you know, a kind of security-based sympathy for Ukrainians, and they're from their policy framework, as opposed to one based on, you know, that grand bargain that Rana mentioned.
Yes, Martin.
Yeah, when it comes to the European solidarity in future, I am not optimistic at all, because I think, as Raphi mentioned, European Union is willing to pay anybody, anywhere, to stop refugees on their way, be it Libya, Sudan, or Ukraine, or myself. I was conducting a research in Tajikistan, and the result was that there is a flow of European money to stop Afghans already in Tajikistan from coming to Europe. So I'm not optimistic at all. I think just Ukraine is too close, and they have free access because they do not need any visas. But I think the direction is more the UK approach, to think of processing all claims in Rwanda. And I heard that Danes like it as well, that this idea to process every asylum seeker's case in Rwanda, and then to locally integrate even the successful ones in Rwanda. So I'm afraid that the solidarity of Europe in future with refugees will not improve. And even now, I think it's our, let's say, central Polish, Czech, Hungarian picture of improved solidarity. But I think for countries like Spain, Italy, the Netherlands, nothing has changed. For them, it's the same like it was with Syrians, the same situation with Ukrainians. So even in terms of numbers. So I'm not really optimistic in when it comes to the future improved EU solidarity with refugees.
So I will maybe follow up as the last one with what Martin said, and I have to fully agree with this rather pessimistic stance regarding the future of the EU solidarity. The question is how we understand this EU solidarity, because if we look at the primary law of the EU, so just for example, in case of asylum and migration policy, Article 80, solidarity is there. It's mentioned in terms of sharing any responsibilities among EU member states in case of crisis or emergencies, but also it's about every aspect of crisis management, so infrastructure and money. The point is that we've seen and we've tested, we had a small pilot project, let's put it in this way, in 2015. really a small crisis in terms of numbers if we compare to the current situation. There was a good plan expressed in the European Commission communication, European Agenda on Migration. There was a good mechanism, at least in my view, so the relocation scheme, and it failed because the idea of relocation was to move up to 160,000 asylum seekers checked from 2 EU countries to other EU countries. The success rate, let's call it in this way, after 2-year scheme was only more or less 34.7 thousand relocations. And this is the answer why this time the EU and especially the European Commission did not decide to launch the relocation scheme based on the Article 78.3 combined with 80, because it takes time, because it has to be followed by the Council decisions. And unfortunately, it did not work in 2015. So simply the concept, the idea was to leave this crisis management to the countries themselves, especially the country as Poland, that is, let's say, enfant terrible in terms of common asylum policy. And we see that it brought some results, because finally, within 2 weeks, the country that was so hostile to forced migrants from Middle East simply put on the table a fully new law, rather comprehensive and rather pro-migrant and pro-refugee. So it worked. Then it's also about the capacities of receiving forced migrants. So Poland counts 38 million people. So for us receiving now 1.5 million Ukrainian refugees, it's not so much. Still, we can do this. So we can absorb them to the labor market and other segments of our public life. The future of the EU solidarity, if we look at the efficiency of the EU asylum policy, we know well that the reform of the common European asylum system launched or proposed by the European Commission in 2015 did not happen. And now we have the new European Commission framework called New Pact on Migration and Asylum, is the asylum policy that is rather strict and rather selective, and it's still not implemented. So the only change that has happened is the change of the name and some responsibilities of the former European Asylum Support Office. Now it's called EU Agency for Asylum.
Other questions? I mean, what we've been talking mostly about Europe so far, but would also be interested in bringing in these other cases into the conversation. Both the US and Canadian governments have spoken about resettling numbers of Ukrainian refugees. Perhaps, Raphi or Rana, can you break down for us the politics and the likely outcomes of those North American schemes?
Yeah, thanks for that question, David. So it was originally, I think, several weeks ago that President Biden announced that he would be first allowing for the relocation, but then it was announced as part of a resettlement scheme. And then more recently, it looks like it's being, the system that's being built is the scheme, as you referred to it, as outside of actual refugee resettlement. And that it's also going to be based on contact and established established primary family in the United States. So that excludes the most vulnerable people that don't have resources and contacts in the United States. Just to give you, I can't really speak to how effective the prospects of this are, except to say, it sounds like it's not benefiting the people that probably most vulnerable. But also say, trivially, I've been in touch with some Ukrainians who are in Poland and Germany who are considering coming to the United States, just various friends. And I give you this one interesting case of somebody who was already planned to be resettled under the refugee resettlement program to the United States, a family with 4 kids who had a missile hit. They were on the resettlement track for religious persecution a year before the war. They had their resettlement interview with the IOM office in Kiev. And then they had a missile hit 2 doors down from their house in Kiev. And so they actually were actually involved in the initial early march. And then they fled to Germany. They are so scared they think the war is going to come to Germany too. So they are still intent on going to Tijuana instead of waiting for a resettlement, because they've been calling the consulate, and of course there's so little infrastructure, they haven't been able to receive even an update based on their case. So they've been there for 4 weeks. They have very secure and relatively opportune situation with friends of friends in Germany, but they are still thinking of just packing their bags and going to Tijuana and hoping to cross, even as the current US scheme of letting Ukrainians in at the border is about to come to an end, allegedly. They're still hearing the information that this channel is open. So, and still wanting to leave aside even their refugee application, and they have family in the United States, a sister at least. So they don't think they'll be reunited with a sister because it's only for parents, right? And children those who have parents and children in the United States. So it's kind of but even those who have some relatives are looking to go around the system, don't think it's a way for them to come to the US anytime soon.
Thanks. And I'll just add, I think we really can't overstate how much the US refugee resettlement system was decimated with the cuts that Trump made during his administration. So that even when Biden lifted the severe caps that Trump had implemented last year, I think something like 11,000 refugees were resettled only, even though I think the cap was something more closer to 100, because the resettlement agencies have just completely lost their capacity to take on this work. And just to note that prior to this crisis, there was the Afghanistan crisis caused by the withdrawal of the US. And so the US had also was sort of quite slow, but fairly steady in bringing Afghans to the US. I think something like 50,000, but they also spent months on military bases just because there was such a limited support system.
So another question for anyone on the panel who would care to react. Obviously, there's been a huge outpouring of media coverage around the war in Ukraine, but what is that coverage not getting about experiences of involuntary immobility, internal displacement, refugee experiences that you're aware of as experts in this area? What should the journalists be covering more?
If real quickly, I want to just jump in and say, I think the elephant on the table is migration to Russia, and mostly literally forced expulsions from the newly occupied territories in eastern Ukraine and southern Ukraine. There's been the Russian foreign ministry, I think, announced in a press release for take it for all the salt that it's worth. I think it was around just under 900,000 people that have been relocated to Russia, some of them all the way to Vladivostok, put on trains and just sent out, like very kind of classic Russian population transfer scheme. And so many folks, many Ukrainians who are basically being put on buses and sent to Russia against their will. A few of the ones that have, privileged folks who are able to come to Europe have relocated and exited and gone to via Poland and entered via Belarus, entered Poland. I've heard several stories there, but most people are relocated to various parts of Russia through these, there's very little information on it outside of this press release. But even earlier in the war, the UNHCR reported there was it was like 17,000 people have gone to Russia. I think it's much more than that, even if we do take the Russian Foreign Ministry's press release with any grain of salt. I think it's much more, and we should consider it, and we should think it. We should think about it in terms of a forced migration that is different than the one we're seeing in Europe.
And just to also sort of underscore that I was trying to respond to questions on like the Norwegian State News channel had sort of, ask questions from the public, and there was some people who were asking about that, and I'd already tried to find information about it, but then I thought, okay, let me try and actually find some more. And I don't speak or read Russian, so that's not very helpful, but I can speak and read Polish. So I tried looking for things in English and Polish, and I couldn't really find anything that was sort of verifiable and sensible, except the fact that there are hundreds of thousands of people reportedly, according to different sources. How many, we don't quite know. And some of them probably have been, forcefully removed from Ukraine to Russia. Others probably have escaped, tried to escape bombing and gone where, the closest place where it was safe. And then we don't quite know what's going on. So I think that would be the one thing I completely agree that we don't know enough about. Not just the media not covering it, just we actually don't know. And that's kind of scary. And then in terms of media representations, otherwise, I guess a couple of things that I've thought about. One is, it's not really politically correct to report about men who maybe aren't happy about not being able to leave. That's sort of, a sort of very obvious thing, but, that's something that we don't hear so much about. Another aspect of that relates also to the political nature of reporting, at least in the West. And I think that goes for most European news outlets and probably North American ones as well. Probably quite different, I think, if you look at news reporting elsewhere in the world, in terms of anything that's being reported is sort of through this prism of how we see the war. And there are sort of things that I think are objective. So the crimes probably against humanity that probably have been happening, that we're seeing evidence of that. There aren't two ways of reporting that. So I'm sort of not arguing for that. But the more broader geopolitical context of the war and how it's understood is reported differently. So I do a lot of research in Pakistan. I try to read the media there, and the whole debate around the war is very, very different in the media in South Asia than it is in Europe, for instance. And also if you read things like the New York Times, which are not that different from mainstream European medias as well. So I think there's something about, which media are we speaking about that maybe is worth just flagging up as well. And I think it relates to the fact that, of course, everything is political. And I think that sort of resonates with, something that Rana mentioned earlier in terms of how people that arrived in Europe in 2015 were from predominantly Syria, Afghanistan, and Iraq. And of course, at that point in time, Europe didn't really want to have refugees from Afghanistan because it didn't really fit the narrative, because at that point we were building democracy there. So we couldn't really have refugees from there. So I think it's sort of how we have media reporting about conflicts, not just displacement, but just the conflict as a whole, is always connected with broader questions of the politics and geopolitics of those wars. And I don't think that's any different here.
I was just reading, and there's the comment in a chat from Carolyn Rose Avila. My friend in Chicago helped receive a Ukrainian family that came across the border at Laredo, Texas about a month ago. They had no problem being allowed to cross the border, nor was there a court date on their request for asylum. They got a bus to Chicago and now stay with other Ukrainian community in Chicago. I've worked on the Tijuana border and in Texas, and rarely does a family come across without being detained, at least for a few days. And this is the policy that Raphi referred to, of basically a more favorable treatment for Ukrainian asylum seekers. In fact, the uniquely favorable treatment at the border, certainly in Tijuana, San Diego, although we've been told that treatment has either ended or is about to end in the next few days. Okay, any other questions from the audience? If not, I would like to go ahead and just invite every one of the panelists to take, say, 3 minutes and give your final impressions, react to what's been said by the other panelists. Marta, we'll just go in the same order of the beginning of the presentation. So let's start with you, Marta.
Thank you very much, because I have to leave you in 5 minutes because it's almost 11 p.m. here. So firstly, I really appreciate to joining this group of panelists, because usually we are discussing any EU or EU member states related topics, mostly within the European academic community. Only during some conferences, we have this chance to exchange our experience, our lessons learned, or our perceptions with the colleagues from other research units in other countries. So I'm very grateful, because what I've heard, especially from colleagues like Rana and Raphi, this is very fresh. So what we can say, we are trying to do what we can as migration researchers, but also as human beings, to provide support to people in need on a daily basis, but also to collect as many reliable data as we can, and on this basis to be able to form any helpful recommendations, policy recommendations for our governors. So the crisis, I know that the crisis is about crisis management, supporting people, but this is also about learning what should be done in the future, not to have this kind of crisis, or to solve this kind of crisis as soon as possible, and how to address this kind of challenges. So the Ukrainian case is only the next case after the Syrian one and Afghan one, showing us that there is a huge need to revise, in my opinion, not only the European asylum framework, but in fact the global protection framework. So the question is, if, for example, the UN Geneva Convention 1951 is still valid, maybe it should be revised. So, I think that the list of questions that can be raised having this kind of crisis is very long, but it's not only local or regional or European issue, it's something bigger, because if not now, soon there will be other emergencies connected to, let's say, forced mobility and forced migration, because it can be also induced by environmental factors, not only war or humanitarian issues. So thank you very much, and I apologize, but I have to leave you in 2 minutes. Thank you very much once again for this great event.
Thank you, Marta, and good night to you. Marta, Bivand, Erdal.
Thanks very much. And thanks also to Marta, and also to her colleagues at the Center for Migration Research in Warsaw. I think if you're interested in these issues, definitely follow them on Twitter, and yeah, they have reports and things that are really priceless. A couple of points, and I think they'll sort of dovetail well with what has been said. I don't think this panel necessarily disagrees on many things, but that maybe isn't a problem, I think. So first of all, I think sort of this discussion and generally sort of trying to follow what's going on with displacement from Ukraine, it is really striking how actually it is very similar. And I think Rana brought that out in terms of the Syrian case. But if you look at, for instance, refugee reception in Uganda, which is often brought up as an example that many of us, I think, know a little bit about, with refugees from many different contexts, including South Sudan and DRC and many others, and with a different approach to receiving refugees than we know from many European countries historically, I think is interesting, because it seems to me that what Poland is doing, and as Marta said, it's to a large extent the civil society and population, and then the state is sort of following on from that slightly, is perhaps more similar to what we know from Uganda than what we know from certainly Scandinavia. So I think there's something interesting there that we can hopefully learn from in terms of how refugees are met in crisis situations. I think that also poses some really difficult questions in terms of these global refugee protection mechanisms that we have in institutions, I think it's always scary to even suggest that we should touch the 51 Convention, because I don't think any of us thinks that the world is going to come up with anything which is better at this point. I think at the same time, we know that it doesn't really quite work. And of course, just the 51 Convention alone wouldn't give everyone who is leaving Ukraine protection, because it's not, it's focused on individuals and their fear of persecution, of course. So I think there are some difficult conversations that could be had when the political climate is ready for that. I'm not too optimistic about that, to be very honest. But I do think that there is no way around it. And I think the European context really shows that, because of this crisis at the border of the EU that we have and we continue having, and where the discussions in the European Parliament and what the European Parliament members are saying is not what is happening at the EU's borders. So there isn't a democratic legitimacy for what the EU is actually doing at its borders, even within the EU Parliament. Yes, there are right-wing politicians that in most countries that support some of these rules, but actually most politicians don't. So why this keeps going on is incredibly surprising, really. And I think one possible avenue to consider going forward is really trying to look at the refugee and the migration issues more jointly. And I think there could have been an opportunity for that with the Global Compacts that didn't quite work out. Maybe with the IOM being part of the UN, maybe there are opportunities there going forward. But I do think that this situation underscores that is necessary, because it is because of other mobility rights that Ukrainians have had that this situation has been, in a way, so far at least, resolved without deaths at borders, which has been the main problem in the EU before. And it is also through the fact that they have rights to work in many EU countries before the war, people from Ukraine, that is automatically now being granted. I don't think we can assume that would have been the case otherwise. And I think that suggests that sort of connecting working rights for refugees in ways that are very uncomfortable and uncommon in Europe, but not in North America in the same way, is something that needs to be looked at further in the European context going forward. And I think that could be good for both refugees and European societies. But I think there are sort of difficult conversations to be had about how that's going to happen, because it shouldn't be the case that you compromise protection rights by giving people the right to work. And in Europe, those are two different conversations. So either you come to work as a migrant or you come as a refugee because you need protection. So potentially there are things to be learned, maybe from Uganda, maybe also even from the North American context, although I know that in the North American context, perhaps the perception is that you don't really have that many lessons to teach, but maybe you do.
Martin.
Thank you. I just want to thank all the panelists and the people asking questions. I think it was a very interesting panel. And for me, the first time to be in this US environment, because our discussions in Europe are always too much Europe focused, and as my friend in Germany says, it's all about Dublin. So I hope that even this Ukrainian opportunity gives us the chance to start a new level of cooperation within Europe, but also between the continents on better protection of refugees. Because what I see now in Europe is a lot of illegal activities, somehow not supported but tolerated by states. And I wish that this Ukrainian lesson will give us a chance for a new start. Thank you.
Thank you, Raphi.
I also want to thank everybody who's attended this panel, Marta E. and Marta P. and as well as Rana. I enjoyed this very much, and I have been thinking a lot about some of the implications of the previous conflict over the last 8 years, and of the EU external and Russia external policy towards Ukraine and how it has shaped a lot of these, a lot of this displacement we've seen today. I've been wrestling with a lot of these questions, and hearing your thoughts. I think we all agree that there's a lot of there's a lot to be pessimistic about in terms of how what lessons Europe can draw, limits to the lessons that Europe can draw from the solidarity it's experiencing towards Ukrainians on one hand, and in terms of kind of creating an international or refugee policy that actually, and opportunities for this at the moment. At the same time, I also, I want to echo what Martin said, that, I think this is in the end an opportunity, unfortunately, and one that I hope that, not only Europe, but also the United States can learn from. I think David and I were just speaking a couple of days ago about how support for Ukrainian refugees for any refugee group is its highest it's ever been in the United States at the moment. And I hope that there's some spillover effect there, but how that the mechanisms by which that might come about are unclear. And I hope that we can have further conversations with various groups that are working on the ground, such as Martin's group, who are working with refugees, and keep collaborating on projects where we can work with civil society to envision better world and better policies together.
Thank you, Raphi. We'll give the final word to Rana.
Well, David, I hope you will take the final word. But I want to echo what everyone has said. I've learned a lot by participating in this panel. So thank you for the opportunity and the unique perspectives you each bring. One thing that I've been thinking about a lot is how the nature of the conflict itself is producing different outcomes for refugees. And in particular, most conflicts over the last several decades have been civil wars, intrastate wars. And so Ukraine is different, not only in all the ways that we've talked about, but also in being an interstate war. And I wonder, and I think that has implications for many of the things we talked about today. For example, the question of gender, or the sex of refugees, and how in cases of an interstate war, it seems there might be less opportunities for men, for instance, to defect, either defect by going to the other side or defect by leaving the country altogether. So I don't know if there could be more sort of lessons that we can take from more historical examples of interstate warfare, including in Europe, from many, many decades ago. And, just to sort of chime into the question that David brought up about media coverage and what can they be doing better. Part of me wants to say, no, I want them to keep doing more of the same, but not just for Ukraine, because I think that their sort of humanization of conflict processes, focusing on how civilians are targeted, focusing on the difficult decision-making that goes into displacing, into leaving. I think it would be a great virtue to bring all of that more into coverage of other regions of the world, even though I am also wary of what Marta mentioned of the sort of good and evil narratives and how those, sometimes too much dominate the coverage. And so I'll wrap up my 2 minutes there. Thank you again.
Yeah, well, thank you, Rana, and thanks to all of our panelists. Just a quick programming note, our next event is a research seminar, which will be next Friday, May 6th, same time and place via Zoom. We'll be hearing from Gyachi Leo of the Department of Sociology at UC San Diego on the question of Chinese politics of outbound student migration, the relationship between the Chinese state and Chinese students abroad. So I hope you will join us for that and for all the other activities that we're co-sponsoring this year between UCLA's Center for the Study of International Migration and UC San Diego's Center for Comparative Immigration Studies. Have a good weekend, everyone.